Mankind's been fascinated with beauty nearly since the beginning of time, but with the invention of the camera, models were no longer captured simply on canvas or in marble. They came to life before our eyes. Photographers were able to showcase the evolution of fashion as never before, and now they had the opportunity to catch a glimpse of the model's soul and spirit with each snap of the camera. Today, one of these premier photographers of fashion photography, whose work has appeared in many major magazines, joins us today. Nigel Barker, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Now, can you tell me a little bit about when your love affair with fashion and modeling first started?
Well, absolutely. You know, I grew up with what I like to say a model in the house. My mother was a model in the 1950s and 60s, and, you know, I was certainly influenced by her, the great pictures of her in the house and in the magazines and on the television, the commercials that she was in. And, you know, I actually started modeling myself in the late 80s and early 90s and transitioned into becoming a fashion photographer mid-90s. So you could say in many respects that my entire life has been influenced one way or another in fashion.
How old were you when you first started working behind the camera?
I was, you know, I mean, interestingly enough, I had always been interested in photography as well. At school, at high school, I sort of studied on the side photography and learned to print black and white and color. My biology teacher taught me, and I used to be a sort of school photographer, but it was never sort of suggested as a job option. I mean, back then it really wasn't. There weren't any degree courses. You had to be an apprentice to a photographer. And when I started modeling, I obviously saw these photographers and worked with many, many great photographers who you know, influenced me enormously, and I realized this was what a great and fun and exciting profession. And you know, it was about mid-90s when the sort of Amazonian period of the sort of intoxicating supermodel period of modeling ended and androgyny began. And I looked at myself and said, I'm definitely not heroin chic, so I'm going to move to the other side of the camera.
Okay. Now, we know you as the on the face on Oxygen, and also that you've been judging America's Next Top Model for 9 years. But now you've also written this really gorgeous volume. I've loved looking through it, Models of Influence by Harvard Design. And now, what was the impetus to start this project?
Well, you know, 20-odd years, 20-plus years, you know, as a photographer, as a model, having worked 17 seasons on America's Next Top Model with Tyra Banks, Twiggy, Paulina Poroskova, Janice Dickinson, Coco Rocha, on the face again with Coco, and, of course, Naomi Campbell and Carolina Kokova, and so many great, famous, well-known supermodels. I wanted to tell the story about how it wasn't just the fact that they were well-known and successful and lucky, but more to the point, how they influenced fashion and beauty over the time, and how, in many respects, they helped shape our idea of beauty by taking risks, by putting themselves out there, and you know, and don't just epitomize an era, but really helped sort of revolutionize people's thoughts on what was possible and capable of beauty. And when we think back in pop culture to the sort of the 60s, for example, it isn't just the Beatles that we think of, or you know, the political movements or sexual liberation, but it's also things like, you know, the mini skirt, and you know, Twiggy cutting her hair short, and the makeup and the whole look of the times. And models are responsible for that.
You've worked with, as you mentioned, so many different models. And in researching this book, what was some of the things that you've learned? Did you learn some things about even people you currently have worked with that surprised you?
Well, I mean, I've been surprised throughout writing the book. I mean, there was a lot of research that was done, and you know, I think when you look into people's histories, some of the sort of surprising things were, you know, a combination of the hardship that they went through to achieve what they achieved. Just for example, like a Naomi Sims, who, you know, was the first black model on the cover of a magazine. You realize that, you know, first of all, you're like, oh, well, that's great. But then you kind of write it off almost because it's not unusual for a black woman to be on the cover of a magazine now, until you realize that, you know, she was turned down by every agency, that, you know, it was 1967 and that cover, you know, she finally got onto the cover. And when she did so, she had to, you know, the agency she went to, Wilhelmina, who was the only agency that would even entertain her slightly, she sent out her own tear sheets to get the jobs because the agency wouldn't do it, you know, and only once she got the job did they then realize that there was some worth it having a black model on the cover of a magazine and in a TV commercial, which she also was the first on an AT&T commercial. So when you hear the struggles and you learn about what happened and and how they sort of fought to be recognized, and the reason why this is so important is because until people actually see themselves sometimes in a magazine or in a TV commercial, they don't realize that they are worthy or even sort of recognizable, as an ethnicity, as a look, as a shape, as a size. And this is a topic of conversation that is obviously extremely hot right now and has been for many, many years.
Right. One of the things I loved in this book was the story about Isabella Rossellini and how she was older when she started modeling. Now, do you think there's room now for older models to come in?
I mean, there absolutely is. I mean, and it's people like Isabella Rossellini that made that possible. I mean, she wasn't old per se by the sort of grand scheme of age. When she started modeling, I think she was sort of 26 or 28 around that period. But that is old from a model's perspective for getting discovered. Of course, she comes from a celebrated family, and she's an unusual circumstance. But when she was recognized, I think it was Bruce Weber who shot her, and there was a beautiful spread. The whole world came calling, and it was a turning point for women in general to be able to see themselves in their sort of late 20s, early 30s, and she modeled for obviously many, many years in beauty advertising campaigns, when prior to that it had been sort of adolescent girls and very young women. So those sorts of moves are important for us all as a society.
Very much so. Now, I noticed that you have two children. Do you think either of them will follow in your footsteps, or would you want them to?
I'd be delighted if they did, but obviously, as a parent, one wants them just to be happy and do whatever's right for them. I mean, I see my daughter definitely has a theatrical streak through her, so I would not be surprised if she's interested, in doing a bit of modeling and who knows what else. And my son, he's already said many times that he's interested in directing, and is much more of a behind-the-scenes kind of guy, So. Mm-hmm. But who knows? Anything is possible.
Including your daughter, if you could give one word of advice for young women who maybe aspire to model, what would that be?
To really think about, first of all, finishing your education and getting, some good qualifications behind you, because no matter what, you want something to fall back on. But on top of that, it's a very ruthless business, the fashion industry and the modeling business, and many people are sort of chewed up and spat out in this business, and it can really be difficult to take all the rejection. So having a good backup plan and maybe treating it as a bit of a hobby at the beginning and seeing what happens, I think is really my number one bit of advice for people who perhaps go all in and then get disappointed. It's a very tough business, and only a very few make it to the top.
Right. And going through your book, it is obvious how our ideals of beauty have changed over the years. It's a constant evolution, it seems like. Do you feel that our focus on beauty as a culture is too prominent?
Well, it's one of those things where if you look through history of beauty, we've always been, interested in it. As far back as the sort of, the pharaohs and the Egyptians who had elaborate makeup routines and were known for their very smoky dark eyes, and you can only see in the hieroglyphics of how they did it to the Elizabethans, who would put white powder all over their face and pluck their foreheads to make their foreheads larger. They would pluck the hair on the top of their heads, and the Chinese that would bind their feet into lotus feet, and we've had extreme versions of beauty and what's right and wrong. Pythagoreans had a theory called the golden section on what was the perfect face and the perfect dimensions. So we've always had an obsession, and as much as people sometimes say, well, I'm not into fashion, or it doesn't mean anything to me, the reality is that every one of us does something to ourselves in some shape or form, whether it be brushing our hair or putting on a very boring suit, or whatever it might be. We're still saying something about who we are and what we are. We're making a fashion statement. Even if it isn't in fashion, you're making a statement about who you are and what you're trying to say. And we know that things like, wearing a dark blue suit in court, has a certain effect on the jury. Right. There are all these sort of indicators that, we can't help but accept the fact that there are elements of fashion and design and beauty that affect every one of us.
What are you working on now?
Well, right now I'm in the middle of my book tour,
Oh, okay.
So I'm today off to Boston. I'm in New York right now, and I'm going to be in Chicago. I'm going to be in Grand Rapids, L.A., D.C., Annapolis, St. Louis, Toronto. So all in the next few days. I've got a very hectic schedule.
Yeah.
But other than that, I'm working on a new television show, which hopefully is going to be airing in sort of spring of 2016. So very exciting.
So now, one thing I wondered when looking through this, because you obviously focus solely on women in this book, do you think you'll do a companion volume about men?
There really isn't one that's comparable for the same time periods. And so, my book, Models of Influence, 50 Women Who Reset the Course of Fashion, starts in the 1940s and goes through every kind of decade till now. And, with men, that really isn't the case. You can't really trace them and track them in the same manner. That's not to say that I couldn't do something in the same vein, and that might happen. And there certainly have been, male models and actors and celebrities and people who have stood for certain points of view and certainly advanced men's idea of what's acceptable or what one can do in the world of health and beauty and fitness and style and all of those sorts of things. And there's no doubt, too, that right now the fastest growing area of beauty is, in fact, in men's, not women's.
Wow, I didn't realize that. Now, when are you coming to Boston?
Yes, I will be in Boston tonight, so absolutely.
Are you at a certain bookstore where people can come hear you?
At 7 o'clock, I am going to be at the Brookline Booksmith on 279 Harvard Street.
Okay.
So I hope to see you there.
Okay, well, it was wonderful meeting you today. Good luck on the tour and on the book. Also, if anybody wants to find out more information about you, I assume they can go to nigelbarker.tv and also be sure to pick up a copy of Models of Influence out from Harper Design today. Thank you, Nigel, for joining me, and I hope you have a great day.
Thank you. All the best.
You too. Bye-bye.